Hello, friends. Welcome to this session on what's there in G20 and beyond. India will be passing on its presidency of the G20 group of countries on 9th and 10th of September when there is the grand finale in Delhi. So, what does it entail for the country? And as people of this very ancient civilization at a very critical juncture for the human society, not just in India, but worldwide. Uh, what does it, uh, what can we look forward to? So let me share some of my thoughts. I'm thankful to Rajiv Bhai from Zena family for this opportunity to share my thoughts. So, first and foremost, G20 is yet another formation from various multilateral institutions that dot the political landscape of the world. So, you have the United Nations at the very top, and then you have, its various wings from the Security Council to General Assembly to the Economic Social Council to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which I've been promoting for past about 15 years. Then we have, G7 formation, we have a G77, we have the BRICS, we have different military alliances like NATO and Quad. So G20 essentially started as a financial collaboration and it evolved into something much bigger with the inclusion of more countries. Now, what uh, is also necessary to be said is that, uh, like what Wolfgang Sachs talked about in his very epochal series of essays titled Development, A Guide to the Ruins, that in the Eastern world, the society has an economy, whereas for the West, the society is an economy. So, as a citizen of the Eastern world, my view is that economy cannot be the be all and the end all of human life. So, in that respect, I believe that G20 has a very limited role to play. And beyond this, we must look at a parallel structure which is far better representative and far better placed to deliver on the needs and aspirations of a world which is battered by climate and ecological crisis, as well as a number of other crises due to the failure of the industrial civilization. So let me begin with my very simple challenge to the notion of gross domestic product as a yardstick for development. So when we put too much emphasis on gross development product, it doesn't matter whether you are healthy or whether you are sick and hospitalized in the ICU. It is more likely that if you are sick and hospitalized in the ICU and more people fall sick and they take care of so much of hospital facilities and new drugs, new vaccines, then the GDP keeps growing. If diabetes grows, GDP grows. If cancer grows, GDP grows. But if you were to adopt a healthy lifestyle, if you were to grow some of your own food, if you were to cook at your own home, if you were to do lots of activities in your community to create localized abundance and a circular economy, then it will not get reflected into the GDP. So what we need instead is a measure of our health and a measure of our well-being. And in that regard, what has been said time and again is that 99% of the people across the world today feel disenfranchised by not only formations like G20, but also the United Nations as well as the nation states, which itself is a creation of the Western civilization. Nation states and their sovereignty came just few hundred years back through the Treaty of Westphalia, which was to stop two wars, a 30-year war and a 60-year war, somewhere in middle of Germany. And this was just a temporary arrangement, and this has no locus standi with our ancient culture and civilization, not just in India, but around the world. So in that regard, I think what lies beyond G20 is the revival of the global indigenous movement, which became orphaned after the death of Dr. Erika Irene Dias in 2017. Few of you would have heard of Dr. Erika Irene Dias. She was from Greece in Europe, but she was a humanitarian thinker, and she spearheaded the global indigenous movement. She was instrumental in the formation of Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the demand from the global indigenous leaders was to put it at the forefront of the United Nations ahead of the Security Council. But over the years, due to the very sly machinations of the Western powers, the issue was sidelined and it was forgotten after the demise of Dr. Erika Irene Dias. So what I believe is that a new formation should come up. Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is like the tail of the United Nations system. It is only an advisory body to the Economic and Social Council, and the composition of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is at the whims and fancies of the Economic and Social Council president. So in that regard, we have proposed beyond G20 a new world body called Gaia Nation. And Gaia Nation would be a truly democratic and representative world body, which would represent the needs and aspirations of people around the world, 8 billion people in about 80 different provinces in the new structure that Gaia Nation proposes. Each such province would thus cater to the needs of 100 million population, and in turn, it will reach out to the grassroots level, as every province will have 50 districts of about 2 million people. Every district would compose of several villages and a capital city, and the capital city would never have a population more than 500,000. Now, this is very interesting that here we see a convergence the most advanced thinking of urban planners and designers around the world, as well as what we find in the town and country planning in the traditional wisdom of not just India, but of indigenous communities around the world, that human habitation has largely been in villages, which are the places where we identify with. Cities are only as transit hubs, as coordinating mechanisms which have limited role as capital, as a financial trade hub, as well as a center for high culture and art and music, dance, and science. So with this formation of every district of 2 million people creating its own localized abundance and circular economy, it will be a truly a manifestation of what we dreamt of as Gram Swaraj and what we call as Panchayati Raj institutions. Now, even though the nomenclature may vary in different parts of the world, but even if you look at Western cities, the mayor, who is the head of the city, has significant powers, and thus there is localized administration. Unlike in India, which carries the legacy of the British period, which wanted to subdue city administrations so that provincial headquarters, which were under the colonialist control, wielded significant powers. Somehow, even after more than 75 years of India's independence, we have not cared to change these fundamental flaws, and we are still carrying the legacy of the colonialist Raj. So, for one and all, we need to get in sync with the modern idiom of new urbanism, as well as revert to some of the best practices that we had in our ancient culture and civilization. So, what would these community states have? So, first of all, they would have their own food abundance. So, it is very simple and very logical that every species, whether it is an animal and plant, doesn't need on imported food from far off places for its survival. And if humans have been doing that, it is only resulted in destruction of not only the ecological systems, but also of our own health. Modern medicine, as well as Ayurveda, everyone talks about eating regional and eating local and eating seasonal. So with these community states, what would also happen is that humans who have strayed into areas where they cannot grow food of their own, which is not the case for India with its very rich geoclimatic zones. Every part of India can grow its own food, and that is what we are supposed to eat. Similarly, there is enough water in every local district, and we should not steal, rob, or loot water from far off places by damming the rivers, by obstructing its natural flows, and denying the downstream villages from getting the flood irrigation, which was also the mechanism for renewing the soil richness, soil fertility. Similarly, we are now talking a lot about circular economy. We are talking about 7 R's: refuse, repair, recondition, reuse, recycle, repair. Yet, we are still stuck on large manufacturing capacities, and unfortunately, programs like Make in India are still promoting what Nehru erroneously called as modern temples, but only later on he corrected himself and called them as diseases of gigantism. So we must create localized materials library by valuing whatever we don't need our household, but storing them in some place where they can be indexed and cataloged in materials library from where they can be retrieved as valuable raw materials for some entrepreneurs, some small industry. So every neighborhood, every district thus becomes zero to landfill, and everything which would go waste is converted into wealth. Similarly, humans have already built more than sufficient housing units around the world. We only need to learn to reuse them without, succumbing to the whims and fancies of building new houses every time, while we forwent we have foregone the earlier uh, rules that we had, the ground rules that every building that was constructed had a shelf life of 100 years, which would last up till 4 generations. But what we are seeing is that every generation is building multiple housing units by raising down forests and cutting down farming land and pastures into plots for more and more housing construction, more and more roads, more and more industries. So this process of converting greenfield to brownfield has already reached its extreme and needs to be reversed. So I not only am sharing this with you, but despite my fancy degrees of IIT, IIM, and the corporate roles that I was working in, because my father already built a house, a double-storied house in a small town, Bokaro, and wherever I stayed, from Ahmedabad to Mumbai to Delhi to Bengaluru to Gurgaon, and now in Indrapuram in Ghaziabad, there is enough choice of living in rental housing, because many people have built them as an investment, which are lying vacant and only for rental purposes. So with more infills, say, for example, there is an elderly couple whose children have settled in United States or Australia or Dubai or Europe, anywhere. Now, why can't two young couples who are working close by, find a suitable match where they provide caregiving to the elderly couple or person, individual, and they also learn from the elderly wisdom that these people carry. So we can create, data, we can create matchmaking, and thus we can create new, neologies of, joint families, so that lots of costs are shared, lots of resources are shared. So thus, by creating those infills, or what in Europe are called co-housing, we solve the housing crisis without cutting down more forests, without destroying more farms and pastures. Similarly, we can move from private vehicle ownership to mobility as a service, for which we set up this venture, Mass Movement, in which, through a 4-stage process, we make every city independent of automobile ownership, and yet they have very high quality of mobility options. So, Rajiv bhai, this is in a nutshell about the vertical structure of how we create localized abundance and circular economy as the building block for a new grassroots to global structure, which is the vision of what I foresee beyond a G20 as Gaia nation. At the same time, there are horizontal layers in which we have badly damaged our educational and health institutions, which have become very grossly commercialized, and perverse incentives are created not to fulfill the true needs of education, which we called as Savidya ya Vimuktaye, or the needs of health care, where a Vaidya was so well respected that he would not even take the favor of eating at somebody's place, because Vaidya was not considered as a profession, but as a jati, but as a dharma, just as Shiksha and Shastra. Yet we see crass commercialization of all these three very vaulted, vocations, which were looked as dharma, shiksha, shastra, and swastika. So we create holistic education practices, holistic health practices, which are community oriented, where a teacher or a doctor doesn't get paid fee in advance like we see schools blackmailing parents and children effectively, and hospitals doing the same. Instead, they earn the respect and the trust of the community, and the community takes best care of them. So similarly, we maintain peace and harmony. We create a local culture for art and music and dance, so that we are not dependent on just digital modes of entertainment, which have become a big drain on health, not only for children, but also for adults. So this is, in a nutshell, my vision of what would happen beyond G20, and in which India should take a pole position as Vishwaguru Bharat, and with our fond memories of being, Sone Ki Chidiya, and countries of the global south, in Africa, in South America, as well as large parts of Asia, should now take the lead, because the so-called global north has already gone over the top with respect to industrialization, and they would need to learn a number of life skills on how to live frugally, how to live healthy and harmony with nature. So in this new yardsticks of what really is wealth, what really is prosperity, prosperity cannot be measured in the current way of GDP, which doesn't distinguish between health and sickness, between good and bad, between what is useful and what is toxic. So in that regard, countries like India and large parts of Asia, including Japan, which is a very important example of how it went to peak industrialization. But as a recent book, which is viraling in Japan, called Capital in the Anthropocene, talks about, how Japan is much better off by slowing down, by rejecting the growth narrative and opting for what is broadly called as degrowth. Luckily for us in India, or countries like Philippines or Indonesia to some extent, Bangladesh, for example, Thailand, we did not go overboard on the growth narrative. So we should hold the horses, and instead of blindly copying the West, we should lead the world in the West, having to follow how to live in harmony with nature, how to live in harmony with ourselves, how to look for progress, not through material expansionism, but through spiritual upliftment, what we call as Urdhmukhi Vikash. So from body, how we come to the level of mind, to the level of intellect, to the level of soul, and how do we connect to what is beyond this bodily existence, is what the focus of and the purpose of human life should be. So with this, I'd like to conclude my session today, Rajiv Bhai. If there are any questions from you, I'd love to share my views.
No, no, absolutely, you're okay. So, uh, It was a very perfect session and very kind of you for having come on a very, very short notice. So, my only request to you would be the kind of preparation that India has gone all out to host the country or the guest on the lines of Vasudeva Kutumbakam. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so there is a behind the scenes, there is a subversive agenda to pull India into the same trap that the West has, landed itself into. And as ancient civilization with all our wisdom, it would be a tough act to steer clear of this trap. And I think there are checks and balances in this country, even though the political class seems to be hoodwinked, or their costs and their lavish extravagant ways of life are so burdensome for them that they easily walk into this trap. But as the people of this country with a solemn responsibility to the marginalized and the underprivileged sections, which have grown in leaps and bounds in the past few years alone. The middle class is no longer in the kind of comfort zone that it was 5 years back. It is under lots of pressure. Similarly, our children and youth are under lots of pressure. So we should steer clear of the G20 trap. They damaged Indonesia a lot, and their next target is Brazil. So I would like to, water down all the hype and hoopla, and let just, this storm pass, and we will get back to our, original way of living in peace and harmony.
Okay, so on that note, you can bid a goodbye, and we all can, as Indians, wish a success to G20. Right? So if you're through,
Yeah,
then you can bid goodbye and
thank
we
you.
can thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.